it began as a hushed conversation behind Kensington Palace walls that aides tried to downplay and courtiers quickly silenced. But the look on Princess Catherine's face as she exited that private meeting said everything the palace couldn't. Something was wrong. And it involved Charlotte. What was first dismissed as a rumor soon turned into a royal firestorm, now confirmed by the very people who fought to protect it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What unfolded behind those closed doors was not the kind of routine discussion that usually fills royal schedules with polite formalities and carefully measured decisions. This was something sharper, colder, and far more deliberate. A confidential charity board meeting had been quietly assembled, one that, on paper, appeared ordinary but in reality carried an unmistakable weight. It was convened under the authority of Queen Camilla, a detail, quote, that immediately raised eyebrows among those familiar with how patronage decisions are typically handled. Yet what truly unsettled insiders was not the meeting itself, but who had been invited into that room. Senior advisors linked to palace patronage oversight figures who rarely appear unless significant structural decisions are on the table were suddenly present, their involvement signaling that this was no symbolic review, but a calculated evaluation of influence and control. As the meeting progressed, the tone reportedly shifted with unsettling speed. What began as a discussion framed around inactive or controversial royal affiliations quickly narrowed into something far more pointed. Meghan Markle's name surfaced without warning, without prior notice, and without the usual diplomatic cushioning that accompanies such sensitive matters. For those present, the moment felt less like a conversation and more like a verdict already forming in silence. The air, according to early whispers, grew tense, heavy with an unspoken understanding that this was not about routine governance, it was about redefining boundaries. And then came the most telling sign of all. Silence was imposed. Not the casual discretion expected within royal circles, but a strict, almost suffocating enforcement of confidentiality. Non-disclosure agreements were reinforced. Protocols tightened. Even those accustomed to the palace's culture of secrecy reportedly found this level of control unusual. Outside that room, nothing seemed to change. The public narrative remained intact, undisturbed, almost deliberately calm. But within the inner circles, something had shifted. The whispers began almost immediately quiet at first, barely noticeable, but growing stronger with each passing hour. This was not routine. It was targeted, carefully orchestrated, and deeply personal. Catherine's expression as she left that earlier meeting, pale and shaken, now seemed less like a reaction to a single concern and more like the visible crack in a much larger fracture forming beneath the surface. Because what was unfolding was not just about one decision or one individual. It was about power, perception, and a silent recalibration of where loyalty truly stood. But the chilling truth wasn't just about Charlotte's health, it was tied to a royal legacy that had long been buried, until now. For years, royal patronages were seen as symbolic gestures, ribbons cut, speeches made, hands shaken. But, behind palace doors, they were something far more powerful. Influence, access, and control over institutions that shaped public perception. And Meghan's role within that system was never as simple as it appeared. What most people never truly grasp is that royal patronages are not just ceremonial honors. Handed out for visibility, they are deeply embedded within the structure of the monarchy itself. They act as quiet extensions of the crown's authority, shaping narratives, guiding public trust, and, in many ways, deciding which causes rise into the spotlight and which fade into silence. For decades, this system operated with near-perfect discipline, guided by an unspoken understanding that every appointment carried weight, and every association reflected not just the individual, but the institution as a whole. It was a delicate balance, one built on tradition, restraint, and an almost unwavering commitment to continuity. And then suddenly, that balance began to shift. When Meghan, Markle was first introduced into this world, her appointment to various patronages was framed as a moment of transformation, a signal that the monarchy was ready to evolve, to modernize, to reach audiences it had never fully embraced before. There was excitement, a sense of possibility, even optimism that a new chapter was being written. But beneath that surface, there were already murmurs of concern. not loud enough to disrupt the narrative, not strong enough to challenge the decision, but persistent enough to linger in the background. Because while Meghan represented change, the system she was stepping into was not built for rapid reinvention, it was built for control. And control, slowly but unmistakably, began to feel threatened. Reports started to surface quiet at first, then increasingly difficult to ignore, suggesting that her approach to these roles was not aligning with long-standing expectations. There were whispers of a more assertive style, of decisions that prioritized visibility over protocol, of moments where the boundaries between personal influence and institutional duty became blurred. For traditionalists within the palace, figures like Princess Anne, this was more than a stylistic difference. It was a fundamental challenge to the very principles that had sustained the monarchy for generations. Anne, known for her unwavering dedication to duty and her almost uncompromising adherence to protocol, reportedly viewed these shifts with growing unease. To her, patronages were not platforms for personal expression, they were responsibilities to be carried with precision, discipline, and quiet loyalty. As time passed, that unease began to manifest in subtle but telling ways. Certain organizations quietly reduced their public association. Appearances became less frequent, less coordinated, less aligned with the structured rhythm the palace had long maintained. It wasn't an abrupt withdrawal, not something that would immediately capture headlines, but rather a gradual distancing, one that, to those watching closely, spoke volumes. Because in the world of royal protocol, distance is rarely accidental. It is deliberate, measured, and often the first sign that something deeper is unfolding beneath the surface. And yet, outwardly, the narrative remained intact. Public statements continued to emphasize unity, progress, and shared purpose. But internally, the tension was building, layer by layer, decision by decision. What had once been celebrated, as a bold step forward, was now being quietly reassessed, not through public declarations, but through internal conversations that carried far more weight than any headline ever could. The system was adjusting, recalibrating, preparing for something that had not yet been revealed. What once looked like a symbol of inclusion was quietly becoming a fault line, and someone at the very top had decided it was time to act. It wasn't announced. It wasn't scheduled publicly. And yet, within a sealed room, guarded by protocol and silence, a decision was made, one that would ripple far beyond the walls of that meeting. By the time the doors closed, the outcome may have already been leaning in a direction few outside that circle could have predicted. Yet those inside reportedly felt the weight of something far greater than a routine administrative vote. The meeting, initiated under the quiet but unmistakable influence of Queen Camilla, carried a tone that insiders later described as unusually firm, almost predetermined. Invitations had been extended selectively, and perhaps more tellingly, certain expected voices were absent. Individuals who would typically play a role in such deliberations were not present, their absence creating an imbalance that did not go unnoticed. It was as if the room had been carefully curated, not just for discussion, but for alignment. As the conversation unfolded, the language reportedly shifted toward something more strategic, more calculated. The phrase, reputational risk, surfaced repeatedly, echoing through the discussion like a quiet warning. It wasn't framed as a personal critique, at least not directly, but the implication was clear enough for those listening closely. The focus gradually narrowed, and soon the broader review of affiliations gave way to a single name, Meghan Markle. What made this moment particularly striking was not just her inclusion in the discussion, but the context in which it was presented. Her continued absence from the United Kingdom, once seen as a logistical reality, was now being reframed as a central concern. Questions emerged, not loudly, but persistently, about presence, about engagement, about alignment with the expectations that came with royal patronage. There were no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices, at least none that have been confirmed. Instead, the tension reportedly manifested in a quieter, more controlled manner. Arguments were measured, carefully worded, but beneath that restraint lay a clear sense of direction. Those who might have offered resistance appeared to have limited opportunity to do so. The structure of the discussion itself seemed to guide the outcome, narrowing possibilities until only one remained. And then, almost abruptly, the vote was called. It concluded with a speed that caught even some participants off guard, leaving little room for prolonged debate or reconsideration. In that moment, what had been building beneath the surface crystallized into a single, decisive action. The directive that followed was immediate and unmistakable. The removal of patron status was not presented as a possibility or a recommendation, it was issued as a conclusion. A line had been drawn, quietly but firmly, and once crossed, there was no visible path back. For those within the palace system, the significance of such a move was clear. Patronages are not simply titles, they are connections, symbols of trust, markers of inclusion within the royal framework. To remove one is to signal a shift, not just in role but in standing, and the way it was done swiftly, discreetly, without public acknowledgement only amplified its impact. What makes this moment even more compelling is not just the decision itself, but the precision with which it was executed. There was no leak, no immediate ripple in the public sphere, no sudden headline to capture the magnitude of what had occurred. Instead, it remained contained, almost as if the intention was not to provoke reaction, but to quietly reshape reality before anyone had the chance to question it. Those closest to the situation reportedly understood the gravity instantly, recognizing that this was not an isolated move, but part of a broader recalibration taking place within the monarchy. But the decision itself wasn't the most shocking part, it was how quickly the palace machinery moved to erase what once was. By the time whispers reached the outer corridors of the palace, the damage had already been done. Quote, "What followed wasn't a public announcement, but a quiet, calculated unraveling of a royal role that once held global attention." What made this moment so unsettling was not the act itself, but the silence that wrapped around it like a deliberate shield. There was no formal statement, no carefully worded press release, no attempt to control the narrative in the usual way. Instead, the machinery of the palace moved in near total quiet, executing a series of internal steps that, taken together, began to erase a presence that had once been impossible to ignore. Communications were sent discreetly to charity leadership, messages that carried authority without spectacle, clarity without explanation. They did not invite discussion, they simply informed. And within those messages, the shift became undeniable. Names were updated, roles redefined, affiliations quietly dissolved. At the center of it all was Meghan Markle, whose connection to these organizations had once symbolized a new era, a bridge, quote, between tradition and change. Now that connection was being carefully, almost surgically, removed. Official listings were altered with precision, her name disappearing not with a dramatic announcement, but with a subtle absence that only those paying close attention would notice. It was not a deletion meant to provoke, it was one designed to settle into place without resistance. Staff within these organizations were reportedly instructed to maintain that same level of restraint, no public acknowledgement, no clarification, no engagement with speculation. The message was clear. This was not a moment to be explained, but one to be absorbed. And yet, beyond those controlled environments, the ripple effect could not be entirely contained. Questions began to surface, not loudly, but persistently. Why the sudden change? Why the lack of transparency? Why now? The absence of answers only deepened the intrigue, creating a space where speculation could quietly take root. Within the palace, in itself, the emotional weight of the decision was reportedly more complex than the outward calm suggested. Because while the process was executed with precision, the implications were far from simple. This was not just an administrative adjustment, it was a shift in alignment, a redefinition of where certain lines were drawn. Some of the most telling moments, however, unfolded away from public view. Reports suggest that Prince Harry was informed only after the decision had already been set in motion. If true, that detail alone speaks volumes about the nature of this move. It suggests a process that did not seek consensus, but rather control. A decision made not through negotiation, but through execution. And for Harry, positioned between two worlds, one rooted in royal duty, the other in a life built far from it, the timing and manner of that revelation may have carried its own quiet impact. As the days passed, the divide between the California-based Sussex household and palace officials appeared to widen, not through open conflict but through a growing absence of connection. Communication became more formal, more distant, more carefully measured. What had once been a shared space, however complicated, was now beginning to feel like two separate realities moving further apart. Meanwhile, the media, ever watchful, began to pick up fragments of the story. Small details surfaced, pieces of a larger puzzle that refused to fully come together. Without confirmation, without denial, the narrative remained suspended just out of reach, but impossible to ignore. And while the world waited for clarity, those closest to the crown knew this was more than a removal, it was a message. In the modern monarchy, perception is power. And in one decisive move, that power had shifted quietly but unmistakably toward a more controlled, more traditional vision of the crown. What had once been handled through subtle influence and quiet consensus was now beginning to take on a sharper and more defined edge. The balance within the royal structure was always delicate, always carefully maintained, was no longer operating in the same way. At the center of this shift stood Queen Camilla, whose role, long viewed as supportive and measured, appeared to be evolving into something far more assertive. This was not a sudden transformation, but rather a gradual consolidation of influence that had been building beneath the surface for some time. Those observing closely began to notice pattern decisions aligning more consistently, internal processes moving with greater precision, and outcomes reflecting a clearer, more unified direction. It was as if an invisible line of authority had been strengthened, reinforced by a quiet but undeniable presence. This growing influence did not exist in isolation. It was supported, and in some cases amplified, by alignment with senior figures within the palace who had long prioritized stability above all else. For them, the monarchy was not simply an institution to be admired, but one to be protected, guarded against unpredictability, shielded from disruption. In that context, recent events were not seen as drastic, but necessary. A recalibration, a return to a framework where roles were clearly defined, expectations firmly set, and deviations addressed with precision. It was not about resistance to change, at least not on the surface, but about ensuring that change did not come at the cost of control. And then there was the presence, quiet, complex, and often difficult to interpret, of King Charles III. Reports suggested that his response to these developments was not one of overt direction, but of measured silence. A silence that, within the context of royal dynamics, can carry as much weight as any spoken command. Whether this silence signaled approval, reluctance, or simply a strategic decision to allow others to act remains unclear, but its effect was unmistakable. It created space for decisions to be, quote, for authority to shift, for a new internal rhythm to take hold without interruption. And in that space, the structure of influence began to settle into a new form. What made this transformation even more striking was the contrast it created. On one side, there was Meghan Markle, whose global presence continued to command attention, whose voice carried across platforms far beyond the reach of traditional royal channels. On the other, there was the palace, measured, restrained, almost deliberately distant. It was not a clash in the conventional sense, but a divergence. Two approaches moving in different directions, each shaping perception in its own way. And as that divergence widened, the palace's response became clearer. It was not attempting to compete. It was choosing to redefine its boundaries instead. Within this redefinition came a renewed emphasis on hierarchy. Roles that had once seemed flexible were now being reinforced with greater clarity. Expectations were no longer implied, they were understood. The message, though never formally stated, resonated through every decision, every adjustment, every quiet shift in alignment. The structure of the monarchy would not bend to individual expression. It would hold its shape, even if that meant redefining who remained within it. For those watching from within, and even for those observing from afar, the implication was impossible to ignore. This was not just about one individual or one decision. It was about setting a precedent. A reminder that within this system, identity is secondary to duty, and presence is measured not by visibility, but by adherence. And perhaps most significantly, it was a message directed not just at the present, but at the future. To those who would step into this world, who would carry titles and responsibilities shaped long before their time, the expectations were now clearer than ever. Protocol over personality. Structure over spontaneity. Continuity over change. It was a doctrine not written in words, but enforced through action. And once established, it would not easily be undone. But even as the palace regained control of its narrative, questions lingered, questions that refused to stay buried. No statement, no denial, no confirmation. Just silence, the kind that echoes louder than any official declaration ever could. And that silence did not arrive by accident. It settled in slowly, deliberately, like a final layer placed over something the palace had no intention of revisiting in public. Days passed, then weeks, and still there was nothing, no acknowledgement from King Charles III, no clarification from senior aides, no carefully crafted message to steady the growing uncertainty. It was as if the institution had chosen absence as its response, allowing the void itself to carry meaning. And in that void, speculation began to thrive, not because the public demanded answers, but because the absence of them felt too precise, too controlled to ignore. Every unanswered question became heavier, every silence more deliberate, until the quiet itself started to feel like a statement. The media, sensing the shift, moved cautiously at first. Fragments of information surfaced, partial confirmations, subtle changes in official records, whispers from sources who spoke just enough to keep the story alive but not enough to define it. Without a clear narrative to follow, coverage became a patchwork of interpretation, each outlet attempting to piece together what the palace refused to explain. And with each passing day, the speculation intensified. Why was there no announcement? Why maintain such strict silence over a decision that, under different circumstances, might have been addressed openly? The questions multiplied, but the answers remained just out of reach, reinforcing the sense that this was not an oversight, it was strategy. At the center of this growing storm stood Meghan Markle, though even her presence in the conversation began, to feel distant, almost abstract. Supporters saw the silence as a sign of exclusion, a quiet but unmistakable withdrawal that confirmed what they had long suspected. Critics, on the other hand, interpreted it as a necessary correction, a reassertion of boundaries that had been tested too far. The divide between these perspectives widened quickly, each side drawing its own conclusions from the same absence of information. And in that division, the emotional weight of the moment became impossible to ignore. This was no longer just about a role or a title, it was about identity, belonging, and the fragile line between inclusion and distance. But beneath the surface of public reaction, a deeper question lingered, one that spoke not to the present, but to the future. What did this silence mean for the monarchy's ongoing attempt to modernize? For years, there had been a careful effort to present the institution as evolving, adapting, reaching beyond its traditional boundaries. Yet now, in this moment of uncertainty, that narrative felt less certain, because modernization by its nature requires openness, clarity, and engagement. And what the palace had chosen instead was restraint, control, and distance. It was not a rejection of change, perhaps, but a redefinition of how far that change would be allowed to go. Secrecy, in this context, became more than a protective measure, it became a tool. A way to preserve structure without inviting scrutiny, to enforce decisions without triggering confrontation. It allowed the institution to move forward, while keeping the reasons behind those movements carefully obscured. And while that approach may have safeguarded stability in the short term, it also introduced a lingering sense of uncertainty, because what is hidden does not disappear, it waits. It lingers beneath the surface, shaping perception in ways that are often more powerful than anything spoken aloud. And then there was the emotional cost, the part that could not be measured through statements or strategy. Something had been lost, not just in a formal sense, but symbolically. A connection, a possibility, a version of the monarchy that had once seemed within reach. Whether that loss was necessary or avoidable remained open to interpretation, but its impact was undeniable. It left behind a space that could not easily be filled, a silence that carried more meaning than any official declaration ever could. Because in the world of royalty, what isn't said often matters more than what is, and this silence may be telling the biggest story of all. Every decision within the monarchy is a thread in a much larger tapestry, one that stretches across centuries. And this moment, quiet as it may seem, could redefine how that story is told. Because what unfolded in silence was never just about the present. It echoed with something older, something deeply embedded in the DNA of the institution itself. History has shown time and again that the monarchy does not, can simply adapt. It recalibrates, often through moments of quiet exclusion that only reveal their significance years later. There have been others before, figures who once stood within the inner circle, only to find themselves gradually edged out, their roles diminished not through public confrontation, but through subtle, deliberate shifts. The pattern is not loud, but it is unmistakable. Inclusion is extended when it serves the crown, and withdrawn when it threatens the balance that must be, preserved at all costs. And within that pattern lies a tension that has never truly been resolved: the struggle between tradition and evolution. The monarchy exists in a paradox, expected to remain timeless while also proving its relevance in a rapidly changing world. It must honor the weight of its past while navigating the demands of the present. And every so often, those two forces collide. In those moments, decisions are made not just for today, but for the version of the institution that will endure tomorrow. What makes this particular moment so compelling is how clearly that collision can be felt beneath the surface. Because while there has been a visible effort to modernize, to embrace new voices and perspectives, there has also been an equally strong pull to maintain control, to ensure that change does not outpace the structure designed to contain it. At the center of this tension stands Meghan Markle, a figure who, for many, came to represent both possibility and disruption. Her presence signaled a break from tradition, a step towards something more inclusive, more reflective of a global audience. But that same presence also introduced unpredictability, a challenge to the carefully maintained rhythm of royal life. To some, she was a catalyst for necessary change. To others, she was a variable that could not be fully controlled. And within an institution built on stability, control is not optional, it is essential. That is where the conflict began to take shape, not as a personal divide, but as a fundamental difference in how the monarchy should evolve and how far that evolution should be allowed to go. Behind closed doors, this conflict reportedly gave rise to a deeper concern, one that went beyond individual roles or public perception. There was an underlying fear that the narrative of the monarchy itself was slipping out of its own hands. In an age where visibility is no longer dictated by the palace alone, where influence extends far beyond official channels, maintaining control over that narrative becomes increasingly difficult. And when control begins to falter, the instinct of the institution is not to expand further, but to contract, to tighten its boundaries, to reinforce its structure, to protect its image from becoming fragmented. That instinct, though rarely acknowledged openly, has shaped some of the most pivotal decisions in royal history, and it appears to have played a role here as well, because at its core, the crown is not just, quote, preserving tradition, it is preserving itself. Every action, every adjustment, every quiet removal is guided by a singular objective: to ensure that the institution remains intact, unshaken, and recognizable to those who look to it as a symbol of continuity. But that preservation comes at a cost. It requires difficult choices, sacrifices that are rarely explained, and moments of tension that ripple far beyond the walls of the palace. The challenge lies in balancing that preservation with the expectations of a world that no longer accepts silence as easily as it once did. A world that questions, that observes, that demands to understand not just what is happening, but why. And that is where the weight of this moment truly settles. It is not just about what has been done, but about what it represents. A decision that reflects centuries of precedent, shaped by forces that are both historical and immediate. A reminder that within the monarchy, legacy is not simply inherited, it is actively protected, sometimes at the expense of change, sometimes at the expense of connection. The contrast is stark, almost unavoidable. On one side, the promise of evolution. On the other, the pull of tradition. And somewhere in between, the reality of what must be maintained in order for the institution to endure. And as the dust begins to settle, one final question remains, one that could shape everything that comes next. Was this the end of a chapter or the beginning of something far more consequential? Because in the shadows of that quiet vote lies a reality the palace may not be able to contain forever. What lingers now is not resolution, but a growing sense of distance, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, yet steadily widening with each passing moment. the connection between the Sussex household and the monarchy, once strained but still tethered by shared history, appears to be shifting into something far more defined. Not a dramatic break, not an explosive divide, but a quiet separation that carries far more permanence than any public dispute ever could. And within that silence, the possibility of further distancing feels less like speculation and more like an unfolding reality. Because when decisions are made without acknowledgement, when roles are altered without explanation, the space between two worlds does not just grow, it solidifies. If confirmation of what has occurred were ever to emerge fully into the public sphere, the reaction would likely be immediate and deeply divided. There would be those who see it as a necessary step, a restoration of order within an institution that must protect itself above all else. And there would be others who view it as something far more personal, a quiet exclusion that speaks to deeper tensions within the royal structure. But perhaps the most significant consequence would not be the reaction itself, but the questions it would ignite. Questions about transparency, about accountability, about the extent to which the monarchy can continue to operate behind a veil of silence in a world that demands clarity. Because once a narrative begins to form outside the control of the palace, reclaiming it becomes far more difficult than shaping it in the first place. And that is where the balance becomes most fragile. The monarchy has always relied on a careful equilibrium between what is revealed and what is withheld. Too much exposure risks weakening the mystique that sustains it. Too much secrecy risks creating a vacuum where doubt and speculation thrive. In this moment, that balance feels more delicate than ever. The decision to remain silent, to allow actions to speak without words, may preserve control in the short term, but it also invites interpretation. And interpretation rarely remains contained. It spreads, it evolves, it takes on a life of its own. And once it does, it becomes something even the most disciplined institution cannot fully predict. Looking ahead, the future of royal patronages themselves now carries a different weight. What was once seen as a stable, almost ceremonial aspect of royal duty is now revealed to be far more dynamic, far more sensitive to shifts in alignment and perception. The message is unmistakable. These roles are not guaranteed. They are conditional, shaped by expectations that may never be publicly defined, yet are strictly enforced behind closed doors. For those within the royal orbit, and for those who may one day enter it, the implications are profound. It is no longer enough to hold a title or command attention. The deeper requirement is alignment, consistency, and an understanding of boundaries that are rarely spoken but always present. And yet, even as this decision appears to reinforce structure, there remains an underlying question that cannot be ignored. Does it strengthen the institution, or does it quietly fracture it? Stability often comes at a cost, and that cost is not always visible in the moment it is paid. It can take years, sometimes generations, for the full impact of such choices to reveal itself. What feels like control today may, in time, be seen as a turning point either toward greater cohesion or toward a deeper divide that reshapes the monarchy in ways no one can yet fully anticipate. Because beneath everything that has been said, and everything that has not, there is a lingering sense that the full story has yet to surface. That what has unfolded so far is only part of a larger narrative, one that continues to develop beyond the reach of public view. The silence, the precision, the careful absence of explanation, all of it suggests that there are layers still hidden, details still contained within the inner workings of an institution that has always guarded its truths with unwavering discipline. And as long as those truths remain just out of reach, the story remains unfinished, suspended between what is known and what is yet to be revealed. Because sometimes, the most powerful moves aren't the ones the world sees but the ones it's never meant to. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.